There is such a tendency in business, and I guess life as well, to think of things as linear. One thing follows the next, which proceeds on to the next thing. And this is certainly true of how we often in our society think about careers. The ideal career path seems to be that imaginary diagonal line driving ever upward. Yet I think we all know this is not how it really goes in careers or life. They tend to be more of a journey, circuitous, sometimes surprising, and they are certainly not always a straight or obvious path. And that's one reason I was really looking forward to speaking with today's guest on Building Brand Gravity, Marta Ronquillo Newhart, a senior and seasoned communications leader. Marta speaks really eloquently about the benefits of moving horizontally as well as vertically across your career, to taking a leap between sectors and subject matters to broaden your experience and your impact, and to cultivating a mindset that embraces the totality of the business. I particularly appreciated her thoughts on the need for communications professionals to embrace and understand their role in revenue generation. Marta and I talked about a range of other things too, like the dangers of getting mired in crisis after crisis mindset given the volatility of the world today, the continued importance and relevance of DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and being clear on what we mean by those things, and also her thoughts on finding sponsors throughout one's career. So keep listening. And if you enjoy what you hear, please like and share. Welcome to Building Brand Gravity. This is Anne Green. I'm CEO at GNS Business Communications, and I'm delighted to be joined by a powerhouse communications executive, Marta Ronquillo Newhart. Welcome, Marta.
Hi there, Anne. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you could be here. You know, as you've seen by the name, this podcast is a lot about what it is that brings people into your orbit, whether you're a brand or an organization, communications professional or marketer. And one of the things that's always interesting to start with for me is the arc of someone's career. You have had a really varied career. A lot of it has been as a communications leader, which, by the way, is a very multifaceted job, I think, as many of our listeners know, and you certainly know. But you also started your career in an interesting way for a comms person, not always common. And I might ask you to start there. I know at Boeing, you told me, you started literally selling airplanes based in China. Tell me about that. And how did you then make the pivot to communications?
Yeah, it was a really fun time. You know, it was a time when there was a lot of competition in Asia, especially for selling the big airplanes. We call them twin aisle airplanes, like 67s, 47s, 777s, and now 787s. And at the time, if you were the manufacturer, and there was only two, if you were the manufacturer who had the predominant airplane in one of the airline's fleets, you could push out the competitor. It was a really interesting time. It taught me about strategy. It taught me about thinking about how are you going to usurp and push out the competition. This is something we do in corporate America every day. But when you grow up in an organization thinking about business, thinking about the commercialization, thinking about the things that advance your company in a way that adds real value, real relevance, and revenue. And then I went into communications. So I took that mindset with me. It was really funny because when I started in communications, I had one person say to me, well, that's great. You can sell airplanes and you brought in so much revenue for the company, but can you write a press release? So, you know, you think about that. You think about that was their mindset, right? What made it such an insecurous route was that coming into the organization with that business mindset, I brought that in. Do you really need a press release? That was my thinking. Are we doing things here that are really driving the revenue of the company and the bottom line and the brand? You talk a lot about brand. And so coming into it in that way really kind of raised some eyebrows, but I think it also changed people's thinking at the same time, which was fun. That was a lot of fun. There were barriers to it too, because people like to get comfortable in the way they do things. And so when you come in and you change it up, they're like, wait a minute, what is this all about? What is this? And so, especially in a very old organization, a tenured organization. And so I had a lot of fun doing that. And I think it really helped change the scope of what we went on to do in the future.
I want to dig into this because you've told me this before, and I think it's so extraordinarily important for us to reflect on this, which is this question of the role of communications. And it can be integrated marketing communications, corporate communications. There's a lot of different slices and layers to this world, right? That role at being at the heart of revenue generation. Because I do think there's a disconnect there in the mindset. And so, how is it that you see that corporate communications or communications overall are or should be at the heart of revenue generation, but also see themselves in that way? Because there's the practical aspects of it, but there's also the mindset, right?
Yeah, the mindset's a big one. I'm glad you brought that up because the mindset that you bring into any organization you're going into, that's where you're going to spend your time. And as a leader, if that's where you spend your time, that's your focus. And so your people are going to continually look at where you're spending your time. Now, if you think about it from the perspective of we are a major part of the C-suite. We are a major part of how the company grows, how the company evolves, how the company competes. These are not normal mindset thinking issues for CCOs or even chief marketing and CCO officers, but that's what it's about. If you're doing something that's not adding equity to the brand, which is money, if you're doing something that's not adding to the bottom line, again, that's money. And if you're doing something that's not adding to revenue, EBITDA, all of these things, again, this all comes back to money, then you're doing things that aren't advancing your company. And companies right now are going through a lot of different activities. There's a lot of M&A. It's starting to pick back up again. There's a lot of M&A going on. So how does the role of the brand play in that? Very much so. If your brand has a lot of equity, it means it's worth a lot of money. And if it's worth a lot of money, you're going to drive a higher sales price when you sell the company or when you do an M&A event. And so those things really matter. And when we think about the mindset of the CCO, so I'm on the board of Page, and we just released a study that we had put together and our findings of the expansion of the role of the CCO. And Steve, your colleague, interviewed a couple of folks, I think about 6 weeks ago on this. Yeah, and they did a great job, by the way. That thinking is really good. It's really shown how the role has evolved. We're not to the point yet where we're sitting there thinking about what we're doing is advancing the bottom line and contributing to the business. We're not there yet. And the reason we're not there yet is how I started this conversation. Where you spend your time as a leader, that's where your people will. So if you spend your time thinking about that, how you're going to add equity to the brand and how you're going to increase the value of the company and how you're going to help build revenue, drive revenue, and EBITDA, your employees are going to too. So it really starts with us. It really starts with us helping not only our people think about that, but spending time doing that ourselves. It's all about relevance and it's all about adding value.
It's great that you brought up the CCO report from Page. And for those who don't know, it's a premier organization for chief communications officers and others at that level and agency heads. And it's a great report. I think what's interesting when you talk about this is the value of that equity of the brand and also the other kind of hard metrics that communications can bring to the table and contribute to. One disconnect I think I've seen over the years, I think we all have, is the difficulty of some senior executives in touching and feeling what brand value is. You know, what is the value of that equity or damage to the reputation? Those things have felt squishy. And obviously there's been a lot of things launched over the years by various entities to try to put a dollar amount to it. But I think it's profound what you're saying because the equity in the brand and its reputation, its growth, its participation in different conversations that are happening, driving the market, driving opinion is really critical. How have you worked to bridge that gap between what might be the measures a CFO or a CEO typically look at, and then the ways in which brand equity is driven?
Yeah, I think it's all about how our roles have been perceived in the past. So how does the CEO and the CFO perceive our role? Some see it as the way it used to be, and some see it as the way they do today. The best CEOs and CFOs see it as the way it could be. And that's where adding value to the brand really comes in. It's interesting. It's an educational process because there's not a lot of CEOs and CFOs that really understand this. If let's take the brand Westinghouse. So Westinghouse brought me in to rebrand the company. We were even looking at an initial public offering. We were looking at a sale at the time. We were looking at a lot of different business activities. And I looked at the brand and I thought, boy, there's nothing more iconic than this brand. If you think about that, what are the top 5 brands? And I don't know, Hitachi, Apple, something. And Westinghouse has got to be somewhere in that mix. And so it was really about getting them to think about how this is a driver, not only to your bottom line, but how you can have a financial value on a non-financial asset. So how is that? It's the value you hold on the balance sheet. So when we go out and talk about the brand and we talk about what it does and what it brings to customers, we have to be very precise about that. We have to manage that in a way that's not misunderstood, that's easy to understand, and we articulate it in a way that's memorable. Because if we don't make it memorable, then whoever is the recipient or has an experience with the brand is going to make up their own way. And you don't want that. You want it to come from you. So here's where it gets tricky, because in a lot of older companies, they do things, and you'll hear this, because we've always done them that way.
Isn't that true of so many places?
Yeah, isn't it? And so that doesn't necessarily mean I won't change. It means we don't know what else to do. So if you come in and you help them understand, if you do X, Y, and Z with the brand, you're actually going to grow the value of it. And we as leaders have to do that. And this comes back to that business mindset. People say, well, you need to have business acumen to be a CCO or a CMO. It's way beyond that. You have to contribute to the business to be in those roles and have that seat at the table. And so when it comes to the brand, this may be your highest non-physical asset that you can add value to. And you have to think about it very, very carefully. Sometimes, Anne, I think people articulate their brand story in a very prescribed or sterile way because they just want to show the facts, right? But you can turn the facts into a story that's very memorable. And I always think about when we were kids, when our parents read us stories at night. They didn't read us press releases and they didn't read us spreadsheets. They read us stories. And tell us a story that we can remember. Tell us something about your brand that everybody can remember. And then you start really adding equity. And then keep your people aligned on moving forward in that direction, because your brand can't be everything to everybody. And this is where it comes down to thinking about where you're going to show up, how you're going to show up as a company, and why. And over the last 2 to 3 years, a lot of companies have struggled with this. They've let their personal emotions get in the way of where they should be positioning their brands. It's a tricky tightrope, but I think it's really something that a lot of leaders in our space should really be spending more time on.
I want to follow up on that one before I go back to some of the question about mindset, because just this week, Harvard announced some new guidelines about what they will and won't speak about, and really trying to read. Yeah, I think it's something we've all been watching. And I'm not a rocks and glass houses person. These kinds of crises can happen in any organization. And I don't like to, I can have my opinions on missteps or good steps. I've been a counselor in this field for 31 years, but I think I'd love to follow up on what you're saying, because I do think there's been a lot of reevaluation recently, just given the nature of the environment out in the world. And, we have elections happening all over the world. The US is coming later this year. It's something as an organizational leader I'm thinking about a lot. How do we stay in community with one another through hard conversations? What is it I want to ask of my own team? And then what is it that we hope to counsel our clients? But what is your thought about how it's changing right now and how folks are rethinking that toolkit and what it is that they should and shouldn't speak out on? I mean, how do they even go around the process of discerning that from your perspective?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good thing that they are rethinking that, because just as people and businesses evolve, so does our approach to them. And that has to continually evolve. And the best leaders will make sure that it evolves, especially with your stakeholder subgroup. I think we've seen a lot, particularly in Western countries. I'll take the US, for example, where things can be happening in another part of the world, but we have people here who feel very strongly about it. And we can't forget that. Even if your company isn't doing business in a part of the world that's affected by the wars that are going on right now, your people may be, because you've got global employees. You've got people, especially in the US, you've got immigrants here who feel strongly about what's happening. And you've got to really think that through. Here's where I think the distinction comes in. As leaders, we have to separate sometimes how we feel about a subject and how the company should be reacting, contributing, or resolving it. And you've got to think about those three things, because if you're not thinking about those three things, you're reacting from your own personal viewpoint. The best leaders and the best business people can separate those two. It doesn't mean you don't care. Of course you care. You care what's happening around the world, and you especially care what's happening today. But you've got to think about the role you're putting your company into versus how you feel about it. And you probably have experienced this, Sam, with some of your clients. They have a hard time separating that. And it becomes very emotional. It becomes very important to them to take a stand. Your company, on the other hand, takes a stand where it's really meaningful to the values of the company, and it's consistent with what you've done in the past. Otherwise, I hate to tell people, if you put out a statement that says you're in favor or you're not in favor, and you really haven't commented on this before, and you really don't know how it ties to your values or your customer or your stakeholders, it's not going to go well. It's really not going to go well. And you may think you're doing the right honorable thing, but you're really confusing your stakeholder set. And even your employees will get confused by that. And they may try to make up their own mindset about where they should be thinking about it. And they will. And they will. Just be consistent. Don't feel like you have to be out there. We saw a lot of this at the time of the George Floyd murder. We saw a lot of companies just piling on, putting a word out, putting this out, and making a stance. A lot of that's good. A lot of it's good, but be a part of the resolution, the solution, and how the stakeholders are thinking about it and how you can contribute to that long term, not just parachute in and say something and parachute out.
Yeah, because I do think that's a very you get a much more negative reaction, when you're seen as inauthentic. I think one thing you're reminding me of is how hard it is for leaders within corporations today, whether they're comms folks or other executives, to gauge the volume and nature of the sentiment they're hearing because of the nature of media today. I remember hearing Domino's, their marketing lead, talk a number of years ago about a social media crisis. It was a food tampering issue at one of their stores. It was this video. It was kind of gross. It was around online. People messing with the pizza. We'll just leave it at that. Google it, folks. You'll find it. But they said at the time that they really came down like the wrath of God about that, because this is food safety, right? But the marketing manager said something that I never will forget, which is we didn't know if we were putting out a candle with a fire hose, because it was very hard in social media. But I think it's true today, too, of your internal stakeholders, your employees, different groups of them, external stakeholders. What is the volume and the intensity of the sentiment, and how to sort through that? It's hard. And that's why I do feel communications leaders who live in the nuance. I tend to feel the best comms leaders are not just binary thinkers. It's people who really understand shades of gray and understand how to live in uncertainty and say, I don't know yet if this is going to spiral in this way. I don't know, but these are not all the voices, and we need to be measured. I don't know. Does that resonate with you at all? It's an interesting question.
It does, because if you put a candle out with a hose, that's better than putting it out with a torch. or because you're just going to ignite it. The thing I would say about the Domino's situation is any company, it's not one and done. It's not one and done. You've got to continue to be out there. You've got to continue to talk about it. If food safety is the biggest thing for you, talk about it. Talk about what you're doing. Don't just have great pizza. Now we live in an environment where that's not enough. We've got 5 generations in the workplace. And there's some of them that think really differently about this. It really matters to them. So we have to really think about where and how and why we're actually coming out on an issue. And it's not just about really thinking about the reputation of our company. We can think about the reputation of our company and protect it, and that's part of the job. But sometimes it goes beyond that. And I think that's what Domino's was trying to do. Domino's was trying to protect their reputation. Yeah, there's a lot of companies today that are doing that quite well. If you look at what Toyota is doing today, remember a few years ago, Toyota and Volkswagen were all over the news. Toyota probably more so now. They're doing things that really make you think about how that brand has changed things, and they never stop talking about it. There's other places too. I think Caterpillar is a good one, and probably John Deere. There's a couple other major corporations. They don't stop talking about it. They're out there saying, okay, here's what's important to us, and we're going to continue to talk about it. Cargill, others on food sourcing and how we keep all sources of food available to all people, not just to different segments of society. And so these are brands that are really admirable. Why do I bring them up? They don't have a magic formula, but they're doing things that are continually adding to the equity. So we were on this path a minute ago of really talking about the financial value of a non-financial asset. That's really important if you're thinking about having and continuing to have a major role in the growth of your company. You've got to have that perspective.
One thing that is interesting about the way your career has evolved, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, both for yourself, but also for those coming into the field. You have moved to many different sectors. Like, first of all, you had a non-linear path in terms of, I'm in sales now, I'm moving into communications, and bringing all of that knowledge with you in a very mindful way. That's one thing, Marta, you always strike me as someone who steps back and says, what is happening here? This is interesting. To be mindful about it and intentional. The other thing you've done, though, is you've moved from sector to sector. You've worked in medical devices. You've worked in the energy field. You've worked in advanced manufacturing, and aviation. And you said something to me when we were catching up recently about it's not just about vertical growth. It's also horizontal movement. What are your thoughts about that? Because I think your career is such a good example of that philosophy.
Oh, thank you. I think that if you, certainly in my case, it was about moving from one function to another and then making it additive. So at the time I was thinking, and they were very persuasive too. So I have to give them credit for that. At Boeing, they were very persuasive. They said, look, you're a good storyteller. We want this here. We want this combined with the business impact, and we want that to sort of rub off on our people. So remember what I said earlier, it was funny coming into the organization and someone said, yeah, it's great that you can make all this money, but can you write a press release? And my response to that was, do we need a press release? So we got to think about
blasphemy, Marta. Why? How could you say such a thing? People have been trying to kill the press release for decades. It still persists. Anyway. Yeah.
And so I think it's just about stepping back and really thinking what's needed. And you hear people talk about lifelong learning. This is something that sign me up. I'm in. Lifelong learning, being curious, really trying to understand what's new, and to your point, nuanced about a business or about a company, and how can we be directly involved in that. And so, I really have always been that way. I come from a family that didn't have any privilege, that didn't have a lot. And so we had to think creatively about what we did have, about the resources we had, and how we were going to distribute those. So you could say, corporations have budgets. Yeah, we had a budget. It was pretty small. And we had to think about how we were going to spend that and what we were going to do with that money. So that mindset really informed how I thought about different jobs. Not necessarily about the stability. I needed that. There was no question. But where did it make sense to take a risk? Where did it make sense to jump off from being in sales to going into communications, to really going that route that really was additive to my career? And I had people telling me, don't do that. Don't go that way. Stay here, stay in sales. Communications wasn't highly thought of at the time. The only thing was, Ann, they weren't allowed to show their real value. And when an organization can show their real value, all bets are off. The other thing, when we talk about horizontal moves, so we can climb up the ladder and each one can be additive. That's something that you want to do. You want to make sure that if you're a climber, that each step you take is additive to the next. Don't just take one because it's in the industry you're in and it's comfortable and you can do it. Why change then? Why do something different? Well, you probably make some more money, but is that enough? And then thinking about it horizontally, taking steps in different industries, in different verticals, and learning how they work. And, I think communications experts have skills will travel. There's no question. You have skills that can really go into any function. So if you think about that in terms of the verticals that I've been in, aerospace, medical devices, multi-industrial, specialty metals, and in energy, you think about how bringing those skills along into each one of those industries can help change it and can help them think differently. A good analogy would be Silicon Valley. So Silicon Valley is always, we call it high tech. We use these terms to talk about it. They think very entrepreneurial. And so you have a lot of CEOs that jump from company to company. Some of them are serial CEOs, some of them are serial entrepreneurs, but they jump from company to company with one mindset. How am I going to grow it? How am I going to make it bigger? And then what's my exit strategy going to be? If you think about your career that way, not necessarily what your exit strategy is going to be, but how you're going to grow horizontally, I'll tell you, it really worked for me because the experience of these different industries made me think about companies much differently. They typically make money the same way. They typically go to market differently, and they typically engage their stakeholders differently, depending on their comfort level or what they're trying to achieve. So you see all the learning that you can get from that if you go horizontally. And then don't forget to take your steps upward, up the ladder. Those are really important, but those sideways horizontal steps, and by the way, those relationships as you move horizontally, to me, they've been the most important in my entire career. Don't lose sight of those. Those are really good ones.
Yeah, it's interesting because so often I feel in life, and not just in business, people get pigeonholed. It's like people want to put you, what's the box you're in? And I've seen that, I've been on the agency side my whole career. So it is, and by the way, I agree with you, this field in general, the learning that you do is unbelievable. I've discovered topics and things through clients I never knew about and never thought I'd be interested in. And it's just if you embrace that, it's such a wonderful career. But it is interesting how so often there's a sense in like agencies will look at maybe a candidate and say, oh, but they've done this and that, but they haven't done this, and it's just a human nature to pigeonhole people. And that can be neutral, or it can be actually really, really negative. But how do you advise people to avoid that trap, and how did you avoid that yourself?
You're talking about categories. So your mind wants to categorize things because it's easier, right? And so if you think about let's say a bus driver, you think about what are the skills a bus driver has. And it's easier for you to categorize them. And I think a lot of times people will categorize CMOs and CCOs because it's easier. Oh, this is what they do. This is what they bring to the table. The best thing you can do is think outside of that box if that's what you want. Do you want them to think about you in the old stereotypical way? Then show up that way, and that's what you'll get. It'll be comfortable for them. It'll hold your career back, And you're probably not going to be very satisfied. You're going to get frustrated because every time you try to push out of that box and hit your head against it or the side, they're going to push you back in. So how you show up matters. How you educate people on what your capabilities are, what you bring to the table, how you participate in the C-suite as a member of a team that's driving a business. It's not always about what your function is. And that's what I love about what we do, is because we don't have to show up that way. Now, that's easy for me to say, right? Because it takes a lot of courage. But the opposite of that is just pure frustration, because you're always going to be held to that standard over there of that category that they want you to be in. The other thing, too, is it doesn't help your people. Who doesn't want to help their team grow, evolve, get bigger? I always tell them, build a resume. What we're doing is resume building, because we're going to do things very unconventional here. And at first, employees are like, wait a minute, what language is she talking? What is she talking about? What did we just inherit here? And after they start seeing, after a few months, that they're getting called not to write just a press release, but called for, hey, Joe, what do you recommend? I'm going to market with this new product. We want to bring you in on the team and advise us. What's the best way for us to really position the market? That's very different. Those are two very different things. And when you get that phone call of the second request, right now you're resume building. You're resume building in a way that's going to help not only your career, but how you feel about how you show up to work every day. And that's what we as leaders, sometimes we don't really fulfill that because we're comfortable in the way we're always seen. And progress is really about going in the right direction. It's not just about movement and cranking out a lot of information and content and all those things. It's about going in the right direction. So as leaders, you got to figure out what's your right direction. Where are you taking the team? And make sure they know so that they can continue to build on that. But switching direction is hard.
Some of what you're talking about, it's really what we hope to be in communications, which is counselors and partners, right? Not just, oh, what is the news? Okay, I will, as you said, I will write announcement, call media. And that is unfortunately a lot of the dynamic that I've seen over the years, we've all experienced. But a lot of it has to do with how you're showing up and then how you're dealing with what's coming at you, how you're, bringing yourself to the table as a peer. I think that's really important.
Change stereotypes, right, Anne? So when you change those stereotypes, not only does it help you, think about all that entire team that you're leading. And if you're in an underrepresented group, think about how you're changing the world for them.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I know in terms of your intersectionality, you've been the only one in some cases in many of your jobs as a Latina, as a senior woman, and that opportunity to bring others along and to kind of open minds about it. What are your thoughts about that journey, that piece of your journey, and how you're able to make an impact today?
When I was younger, I took my husband's name. That's where Newhart comes from. It's my husband's name. And it's a well-known name. It's not a common name, but it's a well-known name. And so it worked very well for me. And I got advice early in my career that said, you know what, this whole Latina thing, this whole Latina dad, ¿qué estás haciendo? Let's just call you Marta Newhart. In fact, we could even call you Marta. Let's just call you Marta Newhart, that sort of thing. And it's interesting because it sort of suppressed a part of who I was in a way that I didn't realize was really coming to a head. I joined about 4 years ago, the Latino Corporate Directors Association. And Anne, you'll love this. I went into one of their first convenings, and here is a room full of Latinos. And I walked in and just took a big, deep breath. And the CEO said, "You're at home now. These are your people. You're at home." And I said, "This is more diverse than my cousin's wedding. I've never been in a room like this." And it just felt so comfortable. And I continue to spend a lot of time with this organization to advance Latinos on boards and to have representation on boards, because we are 20% of the US population. And that matters because we are the fastest minority group growing in the US. And so when you talk about intersectionality and where it is and how you show up, it's so easy to be yourself. It's so easy to be yourself, and no one's going to criticize you, I hope, for being yourself, because that is where you can add the most value. And all of us are in one category when it comes to corporate America. And that category is advancing business, being competitive, and moving the organization forward. Now, how you come to that strategy hopefully is in different ways, so we can get the most value out of those 8 seats around the table. There's not very many. And so to get the most out of that, you've got to bring a perspective that they may not have thought of. And you've got to have the courage to do that. It's not always easy, but I learned that I got more respect in a room full of mostly males and people that weren't from my ethnicity when I did show them a way that would add to the value of strategy and then the advancement of the company. It wasn't always popular, but I got more respect for doing that.
Yeah, and you're more in the conversation that they need to be having. It's interesting too, because this piece about how you show up authentically and when is it easy, when is it hard? We sometimes say in corporate world, oh, bring your whole self to work, which is not always possible or easy for everyone, but it's so powerful when you can remove those frictions and allow people to show up. And I've been thinking a lot about some of the cultural pushback around areas like diversity, equity, and inclusion, some of which is kind of, I think, easy pot shots people are taking for various reasons, a little bit cynical about some of those things. But, one of the things that I think about a lot is what does it really mean to have an inclusive environment, which to me, from a business leader perspective, it means removing that friction so that people's ideas can flow, so you can have divergent thinking, so you can bring out the best in people, so you can move faster, so you're not having people stuck on what did that mean and do they want me here? And and I think it's important that we spend time being really nuanced and thoughtful about what we mean when we use terms like this, and to lean into understanding inclusion in new ways. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's why you and I get along so well, Anne, because we think alike in that people just want to be seen and heard. People just want to know that what they can contribute has some meaning. It's really that simple. And, as CEOs and CCOs, we have to think about that, because we're in the center of an organization where everyone listens to us. What are we doing to listen to our people? How are we spending the time with them so that they feel that and actually appreciate that we're getting the best out of them? Who doesn't want to go to a job every day where you don't have that dynamic? People in the medical field really feel like they're really changing lives, saving lives, making people healthier. And so they can see and feel it every day. To your point, it's more nuanced in what we do. And no matter what we call it, DE&I, and I know some companies are changing what they call it. Some companies are rethinking how they implement it. The data is overwhelming, and the data has never changed. And the data shows that when you have a highly functioning, fully complete leadership team, your company performs upwards of 20 to 30% stronger than your competitors. So if you want to just look at the data, which is important, that's where it really matters. And then you also want to make sure that your leadership team and your board reflects the demographics of your customer. And we're starting to get into that. We're starting to make those changes. You're starting to see different people on boards that you didn't used to see 15, 20 years ago, even 5 years ago. And so that part is evolving slowly, but it's evolving. And that's the good news. And these companies are going to benefit from it. And the CEOs that really push for that, they're going to be much more successful, especially the new CEOs. Because sometimes CEOs come into the job and they just keep the leadership team that's there because it's comfortable, things work well, why not? But when you start making changes, your customers are not only noticing, they're reacting in a much more positive way because they can see that you value them more.
And it reminds me, the old phrase representation matters, and it really, really does. And that's a quick phrase, but it has a lot of depth to it. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and I think it has to do again with sort of mindset and how comms is centered, and also having the best minds at the table to deal with a very volatile world, is the kind of uncertainty we're managing through, the kind of volatility we're facing. And with the comms area and brand and the C-suite overall, there's a real danger in getting mired in crisis mindset. It's like crisis after crisis after crisis, right? And you and I talked briefly about this, but I'd love to share your thoughts on how do you balance that and needing to do it. I mean, they must be dealt with, and it has to be the best. You have to bring the best thinking every time. And sometimes it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? So it's not easy. But at the same time, there's proactive strategy, and there's the things you still hope to advance. So how do you think about balancing those two things, that I'm in the mindset, I've got my head down in it, but I also have to have my eyes up and look ahead?
In the Fortune 100 companies I've worked in, any day can be a crisis. Some are smaller than others, and, some affect the sales force, some affect the legal team, some affect the comms team, some affect different parts of the organization, but they all affect the comms team. They do because you've got to help manage it. The thing to really think about there, and I really enjoyed that conversation that we had about it, was because there's something happening every day on many levels. If you look at any of these geopolitical companies in the Fortune 100, they are involved in any of the issues going on across the world today. We have upwards of 60 to 70 democratic elections going on around the world today that are going to shift markets, and that we have to think about. And so that's the long-term view. And I bring that up because crises every day, when you spend so much time on them and rethinking them and how are we going to react to them, that's where you should spend some of your time, but not the majority. So it's that taking a step back again and thinking about what are the major issues, the black swan events that are going to happen to your company that you got to really prepare for. Hopefully they don't happen, but we all learned through the pandemic, major things can happen that none of us prepare for. So now we're starting to rethink that. We're starting to rethink about what are other big black swan events that we should prepare for. And when you create a strategy and a map for when those happen and how you're going to work through it, hopefully it collects dust. But the recent history has shown us that they won't. It's likely that you're going to use them. So if you have that map that shows how all of the functions, how all of the organizations, how everyone in the company is going to manage through this crisis, and they understand it, your stakeholder is going to be so comfortable. Oh, Anne's really got that handled. We don't have to worry about those guys. That's why they're our partners, because they're going to help us manage through this. That's what they do. It takes planning. So we talk about strategy, we talk about planning, we talk about mapping. You got to do those things on steroids, because especially at bigger companies where these things can really shift markets, and it's hard to get the boat back on track once it's off of track, that's where it really matters. You got to be a leader in that. And we've talked about courage earlier. You've got to have the courage to stand in front of your leadership team and say, here are the big black swan events I think are going to happen. These are the risks. And a lot of these companies, Anne, have a department that actually looks at risks very frequently. And you've got to be able to show the leadership team how they might think about these and how it's going to affect the business. Now, there's going to be a lot of CCOs out there that say, wait a minute, that's not my job. I'm not going to do that. Yeah, it is your job, because you're going to have to manage it when it happens. And they're all going to look to you. Now, what are we going to do about this? Not just what are we going to say publicly or internally, but how are we going to manage this? So if you come back and you do that mapping and you do that strategy and the scenario-based planning, you're going to be much better prepared. And you know what you've also just done? You've changed the perception of your organization. You guys are really strategic. And so these actions mean more than just managing the company reputation. Your stakeholders are going to talk to your CEO and they're going to commit more to your company because they know when these things happen, you guys are prepared. It's not going to be like what we saw earlier this year, where you've got major universities that don't know how to react to something or even manage something that affects their student body. It's going to be different.
And the alum bodies. And as you said, erodes trust. And these are complex issues, but that sense of whether an entity is prepared or not. And I love what you said earlier, that not just what we're going to say, what are we going to do? Because we have to have a seat at that table. That's so important. Marta, as we wrap up today, the title of this podcast is Building Brand Gravity, attracting people into your orbit. What right now in culture or books or travel, what has you in its gravity? What are you excited about right now to share before we say goodbye?
I'm excited about how we think about our function differently. We're starting to push the envelope about what we're doing. I would like to blow that envelope wide open. I'm excited about it because being on the board of Page, I'm able to push that thinking. I'm also very excited about being on a publicly traded board. It will be announced in a week.
That's so exciting. I can't wait to hear this news. I'll be watching.
We're going through proxy season, as you know, and so that's got to finalize, and then we'll go from there. I want to show our community that we are not just CCOs. We are business leaders. We contribute to the bottom line of the business, and we can be on boards if that's the path you want to take. I'm excited about those things.
Well, that's amazing. Marta, thank you again for your time today. Thanks for your friendship and all you contribute to the industry. And thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Ann. It was a lot of fun.